I am Beeban Kidron. I'm a crossbench peer in the House of Lords, where I introduced the first standalone data protection regime for children. And I'm also the founder and chair of Five Rights Foundation. And Five Rights Foundation has a mission to build the digital world children deserve. So I really want to make the case for rights respecting innovation. I don't know all of you on this call. I know one of you who I think probably shares that hope. But where I'm going to start is a public conversation that I was invited to be part of about the measurability of AI. And I've got to admit that given that the participants included Sandy Pentland, one of the foremost computer scientists, who is responsible, amongst other things, for setting out measurement criteria for the SDGs, and Branka Panik, founder of AI Peace, and Rob Fish, who's the president of the IEEE Standards Association, I was somewhat intimidated to make my contribution, which I felt was bleeding obvious. As it turned out, it was the contribution that we ended up talking about the most. So my point was the accepted way of measuring success in the digital environment are scale, attention, engagement, and profit. This sort of pile 'em high, sell 'em cheap view of success is not unique to the sector. It's a pattern associated with what I would refer to as unbridled capitalism. That is, it concentrates on price rather than cost and has not adequately been made responsible for its sustainability or societal impact. Now, in the context of the tech sector, the resources, the natural, the resources that we're using are our well-being, our sleep, our attention, our inner thoughts, our behaviors. And those, I feel, could be seen as the equivalents of water, biodiversity, carbon. And just as in this analogy that I'm trying to make, you can't use the world's resources with impunity and not expect a climate catastrophe, the tech sector cannot continue to demand attention, privilege the loud and popular, only care for engagement, whilst outsourcing the human cost without actually creating a similar catastrophe. And one could even say that the signs of tech warming have been seen in the assaults on the democratic process, the fervent undermining of health cures, the epidemic of self-harming behaviors in the young, et cetera, et cetera. So my provocation to my colleagues was reconceiving what we might actually measure and to illustrate, and in an attempt to illustrate how fundamentally unequal and unsustainable the status quo is. So that I gave them 3 examples. First of all, rather than seeing Bitcoin as an unregulated alternative financial market, should it be heavily taxed because of the energy costs? Or secondly, if automated systems owned by social media companies drive access to images of self-harm, celebrate starvation, or promote suicide groups, should they be mandated to pay the real cost of supporting those who become victims of those loop? Costs of mental health support, free clinics for anorexics, pay reward for each life lost. And then I went completely over the line. So there's an enormous market for child sex abuse, in large part fulfilled by children from the global south to satisfy the appetites of men in the global north. And if governments are not willing to shut down those businesses who facilitate it, which they are not, then perhaps we should be more exacting about the value. Companies found to facilitate child sex abuse could pay for the education, health services, children in the global south, which may, in the midterm, make them less susceptible to this form of exploitation. Now, I'm sure those examples seem radical. They may seem ridiculous, but it actually does illustrate just how far we are from measuring against any metric of well-being, cohesion, protecting planet, or any real measure of prosperity in a deeply sort of collective sense. We only seem to measure the increasing concentration of riches and resources available to the very few at the cost of the raw materials, which are both societal, democracy, community, family, and individual, the body, mind, and in my area of interest, childhood itself. Very often in our discussions about technology, we talk about the benefit and harm as if the latter is a prerequisite of the former. Then we argue about what constitutes harm and then what changes are possible from where we are now. Rarely stopping to ask, what is good, what is great, or what is bloody marvelous, and how do we get there? So with that in mind, I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about exactly that, starting with a vision of really how starting with a vision of rights is a mechanism for imagining the world we actually want to see. And in doing so, I was going to talk briefly about three things I've been involved in. The Age-Appropriate Design Code, the general comment on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and an IEEE standard for designing the world that children deserve. So if I first go to the Age-Appropriate Design Code, or the Children's Code, as it is often called, this really came about when the government introduced data protection bill into the House of Lords in the months after the referendum, which was really in large part to incorporate GDPR into UK law. And at the time, I had a bit of a read to see what it said about children. And really, children only appeared in two places. One is that children merit specific protection with regard to their personal data, but it didn't say very much about what that meant in practice. And it also allowed EU member states to set the age of consent anywhere where they wish. And the UK government settled on 13. Other EU countries have chosen 14, 15, 16, or 13. But what really struck me was that in this complex bill that stretched to hundreds of pages, these were the only real mentions of children, which seemed to me to be an entirely inadequate response. And I think it's worth saying that much quoted figure, 1 in 3 children globally, 1 in 5 children in the UK are, 1 in 3 children users globally, 1 in 5 users in the UK are under 18. It also struck me very forcefully at the time that even before we got to the nitty-gritty of what children needed, it was a wholesale violation of their rights to treat 13 and 17-year-olds as adults, albeit a 16-year-old has different needs from a 6-year-old. Nonetheless, it seemed to me that our laws, our culture, and the convention itself determines that a person under 18 has the rights and privileges of a child. The other thing that seemed obvious to me, although both then and since I've been bewildered at how resistant the world is to understanding and acting on this fact, can loosely be summed up by follow the money. If, as people used to say, data is the new oil, though incidentally they're wrong since data is infinite and oil is not, but that detail notwithstanding, if the needs of data collection, processing, and sharing are what determines the culture and design of the services children are using, then it follows that data protection is a powerful tool to change the culture and design, to make it fit for purpose, to make it appropriate to their age and their needs. So, relatively new in the House of Lords, I sat down to imagine what a rights-respecting data protection framework would look like, not realizing at the time it would take 3 or more years to make it come to pass. And what I came up with became the amendment that would lead to the Age-Appropriate Design Code. Section 123 of the DPA 2018, the Children's Code. And this is really crucial to what I wanted to say today. That the key to its construction was that it wrote on the face of the bill to the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And in doing so, ensured immediately that a child in respect of data law in the UK was defined as a person under 18. An absolute blow to those in the sector who fought tirelessly against me to maintain the age of 13 as the de facto age of childhood online. Citing the convention also brought into play the full gamut of children's rights and the notion of evolving capacity that is central to the convention, i.e., that children have different needs at different stages of their childhood. Until the code, with the odd exception in the explanatory notes of GDPR, regulation applying to children online was focused at services directed at them. Not only was this a problem in the sense that most children most of the time are using services not specifically directed at children, but it created a cynical trend of designing things that might be attractive to children but calling them adult. I thought that the code should apply to all services because children's rights go with them and they do not drop out when they move from environment to environment. After a long drawn-out battle, the government and I settled on likely to be accessed by children. Now, for the record, I wish it said likely to impact, because so many impacts on children are as a result of things that do not necessarily involve their explicit engagement, i.e. the algorithm used for exam results. Finding your gender, age, postcode might put you on a list of vulnerable to gangs or vulnerable to exploitation, even if you spend your evenings in the local library, or the much more mundane but perennial issue of having things about your opinion and preferences inferred by your contacts. Nonetheless, likely to be accessed has been a breakthrough, also bitterly fought against, and has found its way into guidance of other data regulators and is fundamental to the government plans for its online safety bill and is currently under discussion by the international community, including, most interestingly, the US Congress. I'm not going to go through the 15 provisions of the code, but I do wish to just mention the first, which is it demands that tech companies act in the best interest of the child. The best interest of the child is the overarching requirement of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And ultimately, it says when one thing is in conflict with another, that the best interest of that child user is what must be paramount. And what is interesting is in the Information Commissioner's notes, she actually explicitly says that the commercial interest of a company is unlikely to trump a child's best interests. And in doing that, it puts a significant responsibility on companies to act on behalf of children in advance of the children arriving on their service. The one thing I do want to stress is the independent and cumulative nature of the provisions, because those are based on children's rights theory. So data minimization is defined to mean only take what you need to do the service. So gone is the wholesale gathering of every breath and step. But when combined with don't share, don't profile, don't nudge, it actually hesitates the flow of data, because if you don't have it and you don't spread it and you don't share it and you can't use it to profile, then you can't abuse it, and so on. As a quick aside, the chief privacy officer of one of the major players said to me really quite recently that in preparing for the code, he was struck by two things. One is how incredibly easy it was for the product engineers to understand the concept of optimizing for best interest. Engineers are problem solvers, and that was a problem that they felt they'd never been asked to solve. And the other, he said, is that the code is in effect the first safety by design statute in the world. This code came into force on the 2nd of September 2020. It has a 12-month transition, and organizations have to conform to it by the 2nd of September this year. Not the whole picture by any means, but more of a picture than people imagine. Because if you don't make a child's location public to predators, don't target them with harmful material, don't nudge them through the night, don't harvest their data or make inferences, true or otherwise, that lasts with them into adulthood, if you do have age-appropriate terms and conditions and uphold them, if you have easy access to swift moderation tools, if you act in a child's best interest when they come into conflict with your own commercial interest, then undeniably the lived experience of that child will be more age-appropriate. A good segue, I hope, into Five Rights work on behalf of the Council on the Rights of the Child to develop a general comment on children's rights in the digital environment. The convention, with its 196 signatories, is the single most ratified treaty in history. It codifies the needs and rights of childhood. And in many parts of the world, and I've actually seen this firsthand, it's the go-to document for governments to determine domestic legislation and their international obligations to children. And in the 30 plus years since its adoption, it has never been changed, fearful that the provisions may be undermined rather than improved. So, over the last 3 years, after consultations with experts in 28 countries, workshops with 1,000 children on 5 continents, and repeated drafting and redrafting by a steering group chaired by myself, led by Professor Sonia Livingston from the LSE, in March, the Council on the Rights of the Child formally adopted a general comment on the digital world. It is a robust framework and arguably the first comprehensive vision of what a rights-respecting digital world for children looks like. And it makes official for the first time that children's rights do apply whomever and wherever they are, including the digital world. On the day of its adoption, it had already been cited and embedded into legislation and regulation, both in the EU and by the OECD. And it was immediately hailed by the World Health Organization, UNESCO, Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development, and Reprotect Alliance, and so on and so forth. But what was really fundamental is that it puts a duty on signatory states to improve online access for those who are not connected, ensure that the digital world is designed for all children, catering for different languages, accessibility needs and ages, enhance digital opportunities for children to engage in civil rights and exercise their freedoms, including their freedom from interference with their inner life, understands that children are participants and creators in the digital world and requires economic and consumer protections for them, protects them from risk of harm associated with the digital environment, most notably privacy violations and all forms of violence and discrimination. And it demands the development of systems of support and redress, along with digital literacy and specialized training for the professionals who engage with or make decisions for children. The General Comment 25 recasts the child as a rights holder in the digital world and puts responsibility on state and digital service providers rather than leaving disempowered children and parents to struggle alone. It is, like the code, a lever for change. It demands that you think of children before you build and make products, before you take the raw material of their attention, emotion, body, and time. So finally and briefly, I want to talk about engineering and building the system itself. At Five Rights, we thought about the people who build systems. Nothing in the digital world is natural, no lakes, mountains, no constraints. It is privately owned. Man and woman made, can be built and optimized on any principles that we determine it should be built on. So again, we wondered, what would a design standard be if it encapsulated children's rights and needs from its inception? For the past 2 years, we have been working with engineers throughout the world on standard P2089 for IEEE, the International Association of Professional Engineers. It is the age-appropriate standard for digital services based on 5 rights principles. And at the heart of it sit the 3 pillars of the 5 rights point of view: data privacy, child-centered design, and the application of children's rights. The standard establishes a set of processes by which organizations can make their service or a feature of their service age appropriate. It helps them ask the right questions, identify risk and opportunities, and it takes steps to mitigate risk and embed beneficial systems that support age-appropriate engagement. The draft standard is complete and now subject to the IEEE ballot process, but once formally published, it offers a vision of how to design a product or service with children in mind from the ground up. I hope that looking at these 3 things that a broader point has been made, that whether the law, international treaty, engineering, just like measuring AI, they are simply a series of decisions given a priority weighting. And if we continue to allow popularity, reach, engagement, or the profitability of the company to be the only measures of success, then we continue to propagate a system in which all other considerations are pushed down the agenda. My own view is that there are some things that are more important than all 4 of these measures: the planet, equality, and childhood, and that those should be measured. But being practical, as I choose to be, there are some granular cost-benefit ratios that should and could be acted upon without having to reach this nirvana of optimization, according to my view. At a minimum, the privacy of children and childhood must be preserved before rolling out a service. At a minimum, standards of safety, fairness, and protection should be reconfigured as a price of doing business, not an assault on profit margins. And a recognition that children's rights are not optional, but must be realized in all environments. And that all of these are the responsibility of all of us: academics, computer scientists, business, lawmakers, to ensure that the first thing we measure is what we want to see. Thank you.